June 14th, 1944, San Francisco Bay. The morning was gray and cold, the kind of gray that flattens every shadow into one long, endless surface. At 06:20 a.m., the U.S. Army transport ship SS General W.P. Richardson slid quietly into San Francisco Bay, carrying a cargo unlike any other, Japanese prisoners of war captured during the island battles of the Pacific. From the shore, they looked like ghosts wrapped in khaki, pale, thin, silent. The city beyond the mist seemed impossibly clean, too alive. To them, it was a glimpse of the enemy's heart, and it beat without hesitation. Among them was Private Kenji Sato, age 27. Before the war, he had been a farmer outside Chiba, a quiet man who loved the sound of wind through rice stalks. He had never imagined the world could stretch this far, nor that defeat could have a smell, a mixture of salt air, diesel smoke, and American cigarettes. As he stepped down the gangway, the dock creaked beneath his boots. An American sergeant, tall, sunburned, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never gone hungry, stood watching them. He didn't shout, didn't strike. He simply pointed toward the waiting trucks and said, almost gently, "Move along, fellas." Kenji blinked, expecting an insult, a kick, some proof of hatred. None came. Instead, another soldier handed him a tin cup filled with water. The soldier smiled, a tired, meaningless kind of smile, but to Kenji it was incomprehensible. How could a victor smile at the defeated? He drank. The water was cold, clean, without taste, and yet it struck him harder than any blow. In his mind, everything he'd been told in Japan began to unravel. He had been taught that Americans were monsters, decadent, ruthless, godless. But the dock was orderly, the men were calm, the trucks painted a pristine olive green. Even the air smelled civilized. He climbed into the back of a truck. Around him, the other prisoners, about 200 in all, sat wordless, clutching their packs, their faces unmoving. Some were wounded, bandaged with care by American medics. Others simply stared at the sky, at the gulls circling above the bay. The truck started its slow journey eastward. As they left the harbor, Kenji caught his last glimpse of the sea. He thought of home, the narrow road between the rice fields, his mother kneeling at the doorway, her hands rough with work. He had left believing he was defending her. Now he could not tell what he had defended at all. The convoy moved inland through a land of impossible abundance. Orchards stretched across the horizon, peach, apple, almond. Fields shimmered in green and gold. The prisoners said nothing, but each saw it. The scale of America's hungerless empire. A few hours later, near Stockton, the truck stopped for a brief rest. An American private opened the tailgate, passed up a pack of cigarettes, then one by one tossed them toward the prisoners. "Smoke?" he said. Kenji hesitated, then took one. His fingers trembled. He lit it with a match the soldier struck for him. The tobacco burned harshly in his lungs. For a moment, it felt like breathing freedom and humiliation at once. The road resumed. Dust rose in a thin veil, coating their hair, their uniforms. The sun was merciless. Yet the country remained beautiful. Rows of citrus trees, glints of irrigation canals, white farmhouses with porches. It was a vision that contradicted everything the Imperial Army had preached about the moral decay of the West. Here, the enemy seemed orderly, prosperous, untroubled by guilt. By sunset, they reached the outskirts of the desert, Camp Lordsburg, New Mexico, a military internment site prepared for Japanese prisoners. The light fell gold across the wire fences. The wind carried the smell of sage and dust. When the gates closed behind them, the guards stood in silence. No jeering, no threats, only the clicking of padlocks and the faint rustle of paper as the Americans checked their rosters. Kenji sat on his bunk in Barrack 14B, staring at the wooden walls. They were freshly painted. Someone had even placed a bucket of clean water in the corner, next to folded blankets. He thought of the prison cells described in propaganda films. Mud, blood, chains. This was not that. This was something far more difficult to hate. That night, as the camp generator hummed and the desert cooled, he lay awake, listening to a distant American radio playing swing music, smooth brass, the rhythm of a civilization untouched by fear. He turned toward the wall and whispered, almost as a prayer, "Why are they not what we were told?" July, October 1944. The desert was merciless by day, immaculate by night. Each morning, at precisely 06 Eves, a bell rang across Camp Lordsburg, followed by the metallic scrape of boots on gravel. The routine was simple, almost mathematical. Roll call, breakfast, chores, English lessons. No shouting, no whips, only procedure. Kenji stood in line among rows of men, his eyes adjusting to the symmetry of it all. The camp stretched like a diagram. Square barracks, whitewashed latrines, a mess hall that smelled of yeast and soap. Even the barbed wire seemed to have been installed with care. He had imagined captivity as filth, cruelty, starvation. Instead, he found something worse, kindness shaped into structure. Their first meal was served on metal trays, bread, scrambled eggs, coffee. Bread, soft and white, eggs, warm, coffee, bitter and rich. Kenji could not eat at first. His stomach rejected the comfort. A guard noticed and shrugged. "You'll get used to it," he said. Across the table, Lieutenant Morita, an older man with eyes like sharpened glass, muttered under his breath, "They feed us like livestock before slaughter. Don't forget that." The younger soldiers nodded, forcing down each bite as if it were humiliation itself. But over the weeks, resistance thinned. Hunger overruled pride. Kenji began finishing his meals, then noticing things, the softness of bread, the exact pattern of light on the table, the strange calm that filled the air when everyone was too afraid to be angry. Each day, the prisoners marched to assigned duties. Some worked in nearby fields, others repaired fences or unloaded supply trucks. The guards watched, but rarely interfered. A few even joked with them in slow, careful English. Kenji was assigned to the kitchen detail. It was there, surrounded by flour dust and the scent of coffee, that he learned the rhythm of American life, measured, efficient, unburdened by ideology. The head cook, Sergeant Robert Miles, was a man of wide shoulders and an easy grin. He had grown up in Kansas, fought in the Pacific, and now flipped pancakes for his former enemies, without a hint of malice. One morning, Kenji asked, timidly, in broken English, "Why? Why you treat us good?" Miles looked up from his pan, thought for a moment and said, "Because the war's out there. Not in here." Then he went back to stirring batter. The words lodged in Kenji's chest like a stone. At night, the prisoners gathered in their barracks. They spoke quietly, sometimes arguing. Morita would sit near the lantern, lecturing in a low, fervent voice. "Don't let this fool you. Their kindness is a weapon. It's to make us forget who we are." Kenji listened, but no longer felt the certainty he once had. He had begun to see small contradictions that eroded everything he believed about the enemy. A guard shared his ration of chocolate with a prisoner. Another lent him a pencil when his broke during English class. Even the camp commandant, a stern man with the posture of a preacher, walked the grounds each evening, checking on the prisoners' comfort as if it were moral duty. There were rules, of course, punishments. Escape attempts were met with gunfire. 2 men had tried in August. They were shot near the eastern fence. The bodies were carried back under the weight of the same silence that governed the camp. The next morning, breakfast was served as usual. Bread, butter, milk, no speeches, no revenge. That quiet, Kenji realized, was more terrifying than hatred. In early September, the prisoners were given books, English manuals, grammar guides, even a few old magazines. Kenji traced his finger over the words. Life, liberty, happiness. Concepts so abstract in Japanese propaganda, yet here they seemed to hang in the air like invisible laws. He copied them into a notebook he kept hidden under his mattress, writing the English and Japanese side by side. Liberty, Ziyu happiness, Shingsi bread, Pan each word felt heavier than its sound. As summer turned to autumn, the desert cooled. The nights became sharp with wind. From his bunk, Kenji could see the distant lights of American towns glowing faintly beyond the mountains. He imagined what lay beyond those lights. Homes with porches, shops, families eating dinner without fear of bombs. One evening, the guards held a baseball game between the Americans and a team of POWs. The prisoners wore mismatched uniforms, their movements stiff from months of captivity. The Americans played with laughter and ease. When a Japanese batter hit a line drive past second base, the crowd, guards and prisoners alike, cheered. It was the first shared noise of joy in months. Kenji didn't play. He watched, standing by the fence, the sun burning down behind the bleachers. He thought of home again, of the rigid obedience of Japanese training grounds, the shouted commands, the endless kneeling before authority. And now, this absurdity, enemies clapping for one another under a foreign sky. When the game ended, Sergeant Miles offered Kenji a bottle of Coca-Cola. Kenji took it, puzzled by its cold glass and fizz. He drank, grimacing at the sweetness. Miles laughed softly. Too sweet? Kenji nodded. Yes, but good. Miles clapped him on the shoulder. That's America, he said. Too sweet, but good. That night, Kenji lay awake thinking about that sentence. He wondered if goodness could exist without bitterness, if victory always required cruelty. The camp generator buzzed, lights flickered, a radio played faintly through the walls, a song about trains, about homecoming. Kenji listened, eyes open to the dark. He realized with quiet dread that the song made him homesick not for Japan, but for a place he had never belonged to. July 1945, Camp Lordsburg, New Mexico. The heat that summer was biblical. Every surface shimmered, every shadow cracked. The desert had stopped moving. Even the flies seemed to hover mid-air, their wings heavy with exhaustion. By then, Kenji had been in Camp Lordsburg for more than a year. He no longer dreamed of escape. The fence was no longer a cage, only a horizon drawn in wire. The war had become a rumor, something happening on the other side of the world, in newspapers he couldn't read. The routine was unchanged. Wake, work, eat, sleep. But that July morning something new arrived, something that would fracture the monotony, that would make memory itself taste different. At 10:15 a.m., a delivery truck rumbled up to the camp gate, painted on the side, in cheerful red letters, McDonald's Barbecue, San Bernardino, California. Few in the camp knew what that meant. To the guards, it was lunch. To the prisoners, it was a scent carried by the wind that would never be forgotten. The smell came first. Grease, salt, burnt edges of meat, toasted bread, a perfume of excess. It drifted through the fences, thick and warm, cutting through the dry sage and dust. Every man in the yard turned his head toward it. Kenji froze mid-task. He was carrying buckets of water from the kitchen to the garden. The moment that smell reached him, his hands stopped moving. He had not smelled meat cooked like that in years, since before the war, before rationing, before hunger became a national virtue. He tried to look away, but the scent clung to his skin, his clothes, the very air. It was not just food. It was civilization rendered edible. The guards unpacked the boxes, laughing among themselves. Paper wrappers crinkled. Ketchup bottles clinked. The sound was obscene in its casualness. They set up a small table under a canvas shade and began to eat, biting into soft buns, juices dripping, eyes half closed in pleasure. From behind the fence, the prisoners watched. No one spoke. Only the faint crackle of frying meat broke the silence. Lieutenant Morita, standing beside Kenji, said bitterly, "Look at them. They eat like gods. They eat as if the world has no wounds." Kenji nodded, but said nothing. His mouth watered, and with it came a wave of shame. After a while, one of the younger guards, Private Daniels, 19, freckled, bored, noticed their stares. He grinned, called out, "You boys ever had one of these?" No answer, just the desert wind. He shrugged, then tossed a paper-wrapped sandwich over the fence. It landed in the dust, rolling to a stop near Kenji's boots. "Go on," Daniels said. "A peace offering." Kenji didn't move. Neither did anyone else. Morita barked, "Don't touch it." But hunger had its own command. Kenji crouched, lifted the package carefully as if it were sacred. He unwrapped it. The smell intensified, a dizzying mixture of fat and bread and salt. Inside, a simple sandwich, a round of meat between, 2 halves of bread, a slice of pickle glistening in red sauce. He stared at it. It seemed unreal, like something invented in a dream about comfort. He hesitated for a long time. Then quietly, he took a bite. The bread collapsed under his teeth. The meat released its warmth. The salt stung his tongue. For a moment, the world stopped. He closed his eyes, and in that instant, the sound of the desert faded, replaced by the memory of his mother's kitchen, the smell of miso and rice, the faint hiss of fish on a pan. He saw her face, not as it was when he left, but as it had been before the war, when peace was still an ordinary thing. Then, the memory shattered. He was back in the heat, chewing something that wasn't Japanese, wasn't even human in its excess. It was too soft, too rich, too alive. He swallowed, and something in him broke. Tears came without warning. He turned away, crouched low, pressing his hands to his face. The men around him watched in silence. No one mocked him. They all understood. It wasn't the food itself that undid him. It was what it represented, a life where hunger was a choice, not a condition. A world where bread was white and clean, not rationed or imagined. Morita's voice was sharp behind him. "You've eaten their poison." Kenji didn't answer. He couldn't. That night, the air still smelled faintly of grease and smoke. Even after the wind shifted, it lingered. It soaked into their clothes, their hair, their dreams. Kenji lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. His stomach was full, but he felt hollow. He whispered into the dark, to no one and everyone, "If this is defeat, why does it taste so good?" Outside, a coyote howled. Inside, a nation's myth collapsed quietly within one man's chest. Night of July 2nd, 1945, Camp Lordsburg, New Mexico. The camp was quiet after lights out. Only the generator hummed, a faint metallic breathing in the distance. Kenji lay on his bunk, staring at the rafters, the faint outlines of wood grain catching the moonlight through the small window. His mouth still held the ghost of that taste, salt, fat, and something he could not name. Not just food, something heavier, more human, more dangerous. Outside, the desert wind shifted, carrying the faraway scent of oil and fried meat. It drifted into the barracks like a memory that refused to fade. Around him, men were pretending to sleep. He could hear their breathing, uneven. Some whispered quietly, prayers muttered into the dark. Others lay still, their thoughts locked behind clenched jaws. Only Lieutenant Morita moved, pacing slowly between the rows of bunks, his shadow crossing the ceiling like a restless spirit. At last, Morita spoke, voice low but sharp enough to pierce the night. "Do you see what they've done to you, Sato?" Kenji didn't answer. "They give you a taste of their world," Morita continued, "and you forget who you are." Still, silence. Kenji's voice came softly, almost a breath. "I haven't forgotten. I only don't understand. Understand what? How they can be kind. Morita stopped walking. His boots creaked. It's not kindness. It's conquest. They win by comfort. They rot us from inside. The words hung in the air, brittle. Then Morita turned away, muttering prayers under his breath. Kenji sat up. The air felt thick. He looked around the barracks, rows of faces half hidden in shadow, men who had once shouted "Banzai!" now silent as monks. He realized they were not angry anymore, not truly, only confused. The enemy had stolen their hatred by refusing to return it. He rose quietly, stepped outside. The guard at the gate nodded without suspicion. Prisoners often came out for air in the night. The sky was enormous, the kind of black that swallowed thought. Stars stretched from horizon to horizon, cold and precise. Kenji walked toward the fence. The wire shimmered faintly in the starlight. He crouched down, pressed his hand to the sand. It was still warm from the day's heat. He remembered the jungle on Saipan, the smell of rot, the constant hunger, the cries of men dying in mud. He remembered the taste of bitter roots, the stench of his own fear. He had survived all of that without tears, but one bite of an enemy's food had undone him. He laughed quietly, a sound without humor. Then the laughter turned into something else. A sob caught in his throat, sharp and sudden. He wept, silently, fiercely, his shoulders shaking. Not for the hamburger, not even for the war. He wept because the world was not what he had been promised. When he looked up, the horizon wavered in the moonlight. The wire fence seemed almost beautiful, silver lines drawn against an endless desert. He thought, maybe this is what freedom looks like, from the wrong side. Behind him, footsteps. Corporal Ito, younger, gentle-faced, approached quietly. "You can't sleep either?" he asked. Kenji shook his head. Ito smiled faintly. "Me neither. I keep smelling it." They both laughed softly, exhausted by the absurdity of it. Ito looked toward the fence, then said, "Maybe kindness is their weapon, but maybe it's the only weapon that works." Kenji turned to him. "Then what are we fighting for?" Ito didn't answer. He only looked at the stars. A silence grew between them, long, peaceful, unbearable. When the generator cut out for the night, the camp fell into perfect stillness. No hum, no voices, only the desert breathing. In that stillness, Kenji felt something give way inside him. Not his loyalty, not his pride, but the certainty that had once kept him upright. It dissolved quietly, like sugar in water. He whispered, almost to the sand, "Perhaps this is how defeat should feel. Not pain, not rage, just clarity." The next morning the sun rose clean and brutal, and the camp resumed its rhythm. No one spoke of the night before, but something had shifted in the air. When Sergeant Miles passed Kenji in the kitchen later that day, he paused. "You all right?" he asked. Kenji nodded. Miles smiled, then said, "You'll like lunch today. Burgers again." Kenji looked down at his hands. He couldn't tell whether the tremor he felt was hunger or something far deeper. By late summer, the desert had softened. Nights were cooler now. The air carried the faint scent of dust and mesquite instead of heat. Kenji had begun to sleep again, though his dreams were strange. Half memory, half invention. He dreamed of food, of laughter through walls, of the sound of frying oil turning into ocean waves. The war still existed, though at a distance. Rumors passed through the camp like wind, that Tokyo had been bombed, that the emperor would never surrender, that American soldiers were already celebrating a victory no one had declared. The guards didn't speak of it. The prisoners didn't ask. They lived suspended, between past and future, caught in a waiting that felt like years. One afternoon in early August, Kenji's work detail was assigned to clean the mess hall storeroom. He found, buried in a corner, a small wooden crate marked Mail Supplies, Camp Admin. Inside were envelopes, lined paper, pencils, and a set of regulations printed in both English and Japanese. POW mail rules, 1 letter and 1 postcard per month. All letters subject to censorship. No political comment permitted. Write clearly. Write briefly. That night, he sat at his bunk, paper before him, and began his first letter home. August 9th, 1945. To my mother, I am alive and healthy. The place where I am held is quiet. The guards are not cruel. The food is plentiful. We work each day and sleep at night. There is nothing to fear. Please do not worry. Kenji. He folded it, sealed it, and handed it to the interpreter the next morning. It was true, every word of it. And yet it was also a lie. What could he write that would not be erased by a censor's pen? What words could translate what he felt? This strange mixture of comfort and loss, of gratitude and guilt. Weeks passed. He wrote another letter, then another. Each time, the sentences became longer, softer, more uncertain. September 12th, 1945. Dear Mother, the days here are strange. We rise early, eat bread and coffee. The Americans are orderly, not angry. Sometimes I forget there is a war. They give us music, they play games. Yesterday, they gave us meat between bread, something they call a hamburger. It tastes of warmth and of shame. It makes me remember the times you fed us rice with miso. I thought of you. When I eat, I am both grateful and sorrowful. Is this wrong? Your son, Kenji. He never knew if she would read it. Letters often took months, or vanished entirely. But the act of writing became its own kind of confession. Other prisoners began writing too. Corporal Ito filled page after page describing the camp's routines, how the guards saluted them at sunrise, how the baseball games returned each Sunday, how no one spoke any more of dying for the emperor. Lieutenant Morita refused to write. He sat apart, silent, his belief now a scar that wouldn't close. Kenji helped others translate their words into careful, censored English. He began to take pride in the work, the balance between what could be said and what must remain hidden. He became a bridge between worlds he no longer understood. One afternoon, while handing in the week's mail, he noticed a guard reading one of the letters aloud, slowly, with genuine curiosity. Dear Mother, we eat bread and coffee. The guard smiled faintly and said, Guess that's culture shock. Kenji didn't respond, but later he wrote the phrase down in his notebook. Culture shock. He underlined it twice. At night, he reread his old letters. They no longer felt like his. Each word seemed foreign, as if written by someone who still believed the world was simple. He began writing new ones he never intended to send. Letters, not to his mother, but to himself. September 28th, 1945. To the man I was, you believed in purity. You believed suffering was sacred. But now you eat bread baked by those you called enemies. You listen to their music, and it sounds like sunlight. You smell their food, and it smells like forgiveness. You are losing what you were. But what you were was built on hunger. Perhaps hunger was the lie. Sometimes he would tear the pages up after finishing, letting the scraps drift into the waste barrel like small white leaves. Other times, he kept them, folded carefully into the lining of his jacket. The camp's interpreter, a Nisei, second-generation Japanese-American named Paul Takeda, noticed Kenji's growing fluency. One evening he asked, "Why do you write so much?" Kenji thought for a while before answering. "To remember how to speak to myself." Takeda nodded, then said something that stayed with him for years. When language changes, the heart follows. That night, Kenji sat again at his desk, staring at a blank page. He picked up his pencil, hesitated, then wrote 3 words in English. Bread, mercy, silence. He stopped, listening to the faint hum of the desert wind against the barracks. It sounded almost like waves returning to shore. Spring 1946, Yokohama, Japan. The ship that carried them home moved through still water. No banners, no music, only the slow churn of the Pacific against its hull. The men on deck stood in silence, faces turned eastward, eyes narrowed against the wind. Each was returning to something imagined, and each knew quietly that imagination was all that would remain. For Kenji, the voyage was both exile and return. He had spent nearly 2 years surrounded by abundance, bread, coffee, laughter, and now he sailed towards scarcity. In the belly of the transport, his notebook lay in his pack, pages filled with English words he still didn't understand fully. Liberty, bread, silence. He read them each night like a prayer, as if repetition could build a bridge back to himself. On April 2nd, 1946, the ship entered Tokyo Bay. The shoreline looked like a photograph left too long in sunlight, faded, smudged, half erased. Cranes floated above ruins where neighborhoods had been. The air smelled of ash and wet metal. When they docked at Yokohama, the harbor was silent except for the gulls. The pier, rebuilt from scrap wood, groaned under the weight of their footsteps. There were no flags, no officials, only a few Red Cross workers waiting with forms and blankets. Kenji stepped onto Japanese soil and felt nothing. No triumph, no grief, only an emptiness shaped like memory. He took a train north toward Chiba, though train was too generous a word for the wreck of steel and smoke that pulled them. Whole villages had vanished into fields of rubble. Rice paddies lay unplanted, flooded by neglect. The horizon had changed. Even the sky seemed smaller. When he reached his hometown, he found only fragments. The main street was gone, replaced by piles of stone and wire. His mother's house, a wooden structure with paper walls and a small veranda, had burned to the foundation. Only the well remained, filled with rainwater and soot. A neighbor, older now, came out from a shack built of scrap tin. He recognized Kenji slowly, through disbelief. "They said you were dead," the man whispered. Kenji bowed slightly. "I was," he said, though his voice carried no irony. That night, he slept beside the ruins of his home. The ground was cold, the air silent. For the first time in months, he dreamed of America. Not the fences, not the guards, but the sound of frying. That low hiss of fat meeting heat, the smell that had once broken him. When he woke, the memory didn't fade. It stayed in the morning air, mingling with the scent of smoke and mud. In the weeks that followed, he searched for work. There was little to find. Factories lay in ruins, fields untended. Men wandered aimlessly, waiting for something that would not return. In a corner of the port district, American soldiers distributed food, powdered milk, canned meat, bread. The line for it stretched longer each day. Kenji stood among them once, silent, hands in pockets. He couldn't bring himself to step forward. He wasn't sure if it was pride or fear that held him back. Instead, he began to collect scraps, wood, oil drums, pieces of tin. He built a small stand near the harbor road, a single plank balanced on crates. From the back of a friend's fishing boat, he bought minced fish and stale bread. He fried them together in a pan over charcoal, pressing the mixture between 2 slices, seasoning it with soy and vinegar. The smell rose into the street, familiar, yet not. Children stopped, curious. Workers paid a few yen for a taste. He called it Yokohama burger. Each day he cooked, sold, and listened to the oil whisper as it met the pan. He never called it American food, nor Japanese. It was simply survival, warmth shaped by memory. Sometimes, as he handed the sandwiches to laborers, he would remember Sergeant Miles flipping burgers in the desert sun. He would remember the fence, the sky, the strange comfort of routine. He would remember how mercy had felt heavier than chains. One afternoon, a young boy asked, "Why do you cook this way? It smells different. Kenji smiled faintly. Because it reminds me that hunger can end. The boy didn't understand, but nodded politely, eating in silence. As the months passed, the stand became a small shop. He hired 2 neighbors, painted a sign in careful strokes, Sato Foods. The name felt foreign on the wood, yet right. People came not just for the food, but for the warmth, an echo of something they couldn't name, but missed deeply. At night, Kenji would close the shutters and sit by the oil lamp, reading from his notebook. Bread, mercy, silence. He added new words now. Forgiveness, rebirth, home. Sometimes he imagined sending another letter to his mother, though there was no address left to send it to. He would have written, I have returned. The land is broken, but I have found work that feeds others. I have learned that kindness is heavier to carry than hate, yet I carry it still. He would pause there, pen hovering, unsure how to end. Then he would close the notebook, listen to the faint hiss of cooling oil, and let the night fold around him. Outside, the city rebuilt itself in small noises, hammers, footsteps, voices returning. And somewhere, beyond the dark horizon, the smell of fried food rose into the cold spring air, the smell of memory turning quietly into life. Autumn 1962, Yokohama, Japan. The years had folded gently over the ruins. By 1962, Yokohama no longer smelled of ash, but of steam and oil and the wet salt of the harbor. Cargo ships hummed in and out. Neon signs blinked in English. Children rode bicycles through streets that had once been gravel and sorrow. On the corner of Yamashita Avenue, beneath the soft rattle of streetcars, a modest wooden shop still stood. Sato Foods, painted now in English and Japanese. Inside, behind the counter, Kenji Sato, age 45, moved slowly, deliberately. His hair was grey at the edges, his hands calloused but steady. Each morning, he opened the shutters, lit the stove, and let the smell of frying fish and bread drift into the street. He had built a life out of ordinary gestures. He had married once, briefly, kindly. The marriage had dissolved like fog. He had no children. Only the shop, the notebooks, and the habit of listening to the radio while he cooked. That autumn afternoon, an American stepped through the door. He was young, early 30s, clean-cut, wearing a pressed shirt and round glasses. He spoke careful Japanese, halting but respectful. Mr. Sato, my name is David Harper. I'm a historian. I'm studying Japanese prisoners of war who were held in the United States during World War II. Kenji looked up from the stove, studying him for a moment before replying softly. Yes, I was one. Harper smiled, nervous, relieved. He unfolded a small notebook. I read a report mentioning Camp Lordsburg. I've come to ask what it was like, what you remember. Kenji gestured for him to sit. He poured 2 cups of tea, the steam rising between them like a veil. The American took a sip and said, I hope this isn't painful. Kenji shook his head. No, pain ends. Memory does not. For a while they talked of small things. The desert, the barracks, the music on the radios, the long heat of New Mexico. Kenji's voice was calm, almost detached, as if describing a dream. Then Harper asked, was there a moment you remember most, something that stayed with you? Kenji fell silent. He turned down the stove, wiped his hands on his apron, and said quietly, yes, I remember the first time I tasted their food. He paused, eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the walls. I thought it would poison me, he said. I had been told everything about them was poison, their words, their freedom, even their smiles. But when I bit into it, it was not poison. It was warmth. It was life. It was everything I had been told to reject. He smiled faintly, without irony. I wept, you know. I cried because kindness was unbearable. Harper wrote nothing for a long time, Then he asked, "And what did you learn from that?" Kenji looked at him, eyes calm, steady. "I learned that hatred is easy, that mercy is the harder discipline, and that the world is larger than the fences we build to protect our pride." A long silence. The only sound was the soft popping of oil on the stove. Then Kenji said, almost as an afterthought, "Do you know what they called it? The food that changed me?" Harper shook his head. "A hamburger," Kenji said, almost laughing. It was absurd, sacred in its absurdity. He reached for a pan, pressed 2 pieces of bread around a small patty of fish, let it fry until the edges browned. He slid it onto a plate and placed it before the historian. "Try," he said. Harper hesitated, then bit in. It was simple, salty, warm, ordinary, but the look in his eyes changed, as if tasting something more than food. Kenji watched him quietly, then murmured, "War teaches us to hate. Hunger teaches us to obey. But kindness breaks us, because it asks us to change." Outside, the street had begun to glow with evening lights. Children laughed somewhere beyond the window. A train passed, its whistle long and low, fading toward the sea. Harper closed his notebook, stood, and bowed deeply. "Thank you, Mr. Sato," he said, "for everything." Kenji smiled faintly. "Remember it truthfully," he replied, "not as heroism, but as hunger finding peace." The door closed behind the historian, the bell chiming softly. Kenji turned off the stove. He stood a moment in the quiet, listening to the city breathing beyond the glass. On the counter, beside the half-empty teapot, lay his old notebook. He opened it to the first page, yellowed with years. The words stared back at him in 2 languages. Simple, unadorned, bred mercy silence. He traced them with his finger, then added a new line beneath, in his slow, careful hand. Forgiveness. He closed the book, turned out the light, and stepped outside. The air was cool, the harbor dark but alive. Somewhere a radio played faintly, American jazz again, drifting like an echo from another lifetime. He walked home slowly, coat pulled tight, the faint smell of fried oil clinging to him like memory. And for the first time in many years, Kenji allowed himself a small, unguarded smile.